If the 17th century was the age of reason, that had a lot to do with widespread revulsion at the effects of the wars of religion, and in particular the violence and bloodshed of the 30 Years' War. The disaster of the 30 Years' War shook the foundations of government all across Europe. Historians call this the crisis of the 17th century. The widespread crisis experienced by European monarchies had many sources. First, financial. The sheer cost of the war. It wounded economies that had already been hurt by the inflation at the beginning of the 17th century, and it exhausted royal treasuries. Then there was aristocratic dissatisfaction. The nobility in France, England, Spain, etc., had resented the growth of the state and the centralizing tendencies of post-Renaissance monarchies. This is the other side, the flip side to Lecture 5. They used the opportunity of royal financial exhaustion and resentment of these wars to try to get some power back through government office and through rebellion. Then the merchants were dissatisfied. They objected to the high taxes needed to pay for the wars, the disruption of trade, the neglect of exploration in colonies and markets, and sometimes even the peasantry joined in. They were the primary victims of these wars. Much farmland was laid waste, many peasants were killed, and they were the primary payers for it through taxes. Now, we're not going to try to sort out the crisis for every state in Europe. Rather, we're going to concentrate on two, for they provided models of government that, it could be argued, have served the West ever since. France, which embraced a conservative attempt to revive a modified great chain of being via royal absolutism, a sort of Hobbesian solution, and England, which came to embrace a more liberal, constitutional arrangement known as constitutional monarchy, the Lockean solution. In this lecture, France. Now, you will recall that France had suffered terribly during the first waves of the wars of religion, massacres, assassinations, terrible religious hatreds, and violence. France had emerged from these troubles under the leadership of Henry of Bourbon, who founded the Bourbon line and became Henry IV in 1589. Now, Henry IV was famous for his bravery, his approachability, his practicality. He was an effective military leader, but also something of a compromise candidate. Remember that he was raised a Protestant, but had converted to Roman Catholicism. To reassure Protestants, he promulgated the Edict of Nantes, granting toleration to Huguenots in 1598. With his financial minister, Maximilien de Bethune, Duc de Sully, he sought to limit the power of the nobles, to end religious and blood feuds, to limit the power of regional assemblies called Parlement, the most powerful of which was at Paris. He began to build up an extensive local bureaucracy. He raised money to pay for it by selling offices. He centralized the economy. He established government monopolies on gunpowder, mines, salt. He built a canal system linking Atlantic and Mediterranean ports. He established the royal corvée, a draft of peasants to work on the French roads during the summer. But he also reduced taxes on those peasants. All of these things were good for the king, good for the French economy, good for France in general, but they also gave just about everybody in France a reason to grumble. In 1610, he was assassinated by a Catholic sympathizer. Louis XIII, his son, was not nearly so impressive. He was raised in an extremely sheltered environment, and he basically let other people run his government. From 1624, he left real power in the hands of his chief minister, Armand Jean Duplessis, Duc de Richelieu, better known to history and readers of Alexandre Dumas as Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu continued Henry IV's policies. He reduced the power of the nobles and the local parlement. He imprisoned powerful political enemies. He attacked and captured the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle in 1628, so he had no love for Protestants. He kept a tight rein on the Catholic Church in France, and he centralized the economy, encouraging exploration and colonization of the Americas. He also, as we saw in a previous lecture, pursued an aggressive anti-Habsburg foreign policy by entering the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side. By the time of Louis and Richelieu's deaths in 1643, France was the most powerful nation in Europe. Noble power seemed broken, but so was the royal treasury. The country groaned under excessive taxation. Louis XIV ascended the French throne at the age of 4. So real power is going to be in the hands of his mother, Anne of Austria, and Jules Cardinal Mazarin, a student of Richelieu's. Now, the nobles of France, heretofore beaten down by a strong Bourbon monarchy, saw their chance. Their resentment exploded in a rebellion known as the Fronde. And by the way, let me say that if you're going to name a rebellion, this is a terrific one. The Fronde means the slingshot. It began at court with the wives of imprisoned nobles demanding their release. Their cause was taken up by the Parlement of Paris and then joined by the people of Paris. Eventually, they were also joined by much of the nobility and some of the towns who'd been groaning under that taxation. In 1648, Paris revolted. In 1649, the Prince de Condé, France's greatest general in the 30 Years' War, restored order, but then embraced the Fronde himself. In 1651, Paris fell to the rebels, and Louis was forced to flee the Louvre, the principal royal residence. This would remain a bitter childhood memory. He would never forget the night that he had to be smuggled out of his own palace. Now, the Frondeur state ruled France for about 2 years in Louis's name, but not terribly well. It was inefficient and corrupt. And remember that the French had always had a strong belief in the sanctity of monarchy, dated back to the Middle Ages, a belief that French kings had been careful to cultivate. And so the failures of the Frondeur state seemed to reaffirm the great chain of being. Break it and you'll be punished. In 1652, Louis and Mazarin were returned to power by popular demand. Now, Louis would never forget the humiliation of being forced to sneak out of his own palace, and he was determined that he would never again be forced into submission by his own nobles or anyone else in France. For a decade, Mazarin tutored the young king in the ways of kingship. But following Mazarin's death in 1661, he declared himself of age. He announced that he would rule without the aid of a chief minister, and he immediately began to perfect the absolutist state that his grandfather, Henry IV, and Cardinal Richelieu had begun to erect. Now, I would argue that there were 5 main features to that state, and I call them Louis XIV's 5 rules of absolutism. But you understand, of course, that Louis never sat down and wrote out 5 rules. This is Bucholz talking. The 5 rules of absolutism are as follows. The king must be godlike. The king must be in control. The king must be wealthy. The king must enforce religious conformity. The king must have an army. First, the king must be godlike. Louis had been raised to believe that he was unlike other men. As king, he was God's lieutenant, wielding his power. As Louis, the son of kings, he had been chosen by God for this role. He embodied God's power on earth. That is, he was the physical body that represented both God and France. But of course, Louis' subjects had forgotten all that, or else they wouldn't have gone on the Fronde. So he began a program to redefine his image. He established royal academies of art, of music, of literature and rhetoric, of drama and science and medals. He trained and supported numerous artists and scholars generously. In return, their job was to create art which glorified Louis XIV in buildings, in statues, in paintings, in opera, in scientific discoveries dedicated to him, in medals continually struck for his many victories. He legislated that the French style in art was to be classical, harking back to the golden age of Greece and Rome. If Ronald Reagan harked back to the cowboy in American life, Louis was looking for an image of greatness, and he found it in the Roman emperors and Alexander the Great. If you read the plays of Racine and Corneille, you'll see this. Everywhere he was portrayed as Apollo, or painted with the symbols of Apollo, a lyre and a laurel. Apollo was, of course, the Greek god of the sun. Louis chose the sun as his symbol because the sun is the center of the solar system. He's a Copernican. the source of all life itself. When you saw the sun on the side of a building, when you saw the sun depicted on a medal, when you saw the sun in the sky, you were supposed to think of le roi soleil, the Sun King. He maintained strict censorship of the arts to ensure that the message was never diluted. What if you violated the rules? What if you criticized the king or the absolute state? Well, that's what we have the Bastille for. Versailles was the epitome of this program of magnificence. Now, originally, Versailles was a royal hunting lodge located about 15 miles outside of Paris. That's the first key, outside of Paris. Louis had no love for Paris. He spent 1/2 of the French royal revenue. Now think about that. What if the President of the United States went to Congress and said, I want to take half of the government revenue and I want to spend it on a new house? He spent it on 30,000 workmen who worked 20 years to build thousands of rooms and extensive gardens. Versailles' sheer size was a monument to Louis and the wealth of France. But its size was also a political strategy. You know the phrase, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Versailles was big enough to house all the nobility of France, keeping them under Louis's watchful eye, away from Paris, away from the countryside where they could plot against him. Of course, Versailles' gates, entrance halls, dining halls, boudoirs were all decorated with portraits of Louis. There were tapestries, paintings of his great achievements. The Great Hall of Mirrors celebrated his battles. And of course, everywhere you looked, the sun. Just to make sure that everyone got the hint, at the center of the palace was not a throne room, not a cabinet room, certainly not a hall where the Estates General could meet. There was instead the king's bedchamber. Make no mistake, Louis was the beating heart of France. The king's daily routine emphasized this. Upon rising, the levée, there was an elaborate dressing ritual in which different noblemen held particular articles of the king's clothing. This was a chance for them to have the king's ear, to ask a favor, a pension, a job, some land. It served the king by allowing him to watch his nobles, by breaking them into subservience. Imagine, holding the king's shirt was a job to be fought over jealously. It was considered more honorable than any military or civil command. And of course, if you spent all your day angling to hold the king's shirt, you weren't plotting rebellion. Morning Mass followed the levée in the Chapel Royal. It was attended by the king and his court. Now, according to one observer, and I haven't been able to verify this with more, Louis alone faced the altar. The courtiers faced Louis because he was their conduit to God. There then might follow long cabinet meetings in the mid-morning, lots of business. Louis often skipped lunch. One of the themes of this lecture is that he was a very hard worker. The afternoon was spent hunting, riding, shooting. These were viewed as kingly and aristocratic sports, like presidents jogging today. The evening was spent watching an opera or at a play or gambling, though Louis often skipped this frivolity because he had business to do. Late, perhaps 10 p.m., there was a supper in state, which means that Louis was served by cupbearers, carvers, servers on bended knee. There was live music. No one else dined with him. Spectators stood about to watch God on earth eat. He then retired with the spectacle of the coucher. A candle was held for him as he entered the bedchamber. He had assistants undressing, and then he got into bed. When everyone else had gone, he probably got out of his ceremonial bed and snuck off to a smaller bedchamber to sleep or to spend the night with one of his mistresses. Now, when I explain all this to my undergraduate students, they usually react in shock and horror at the sheer egotism seemingly on display here. But Louis would have said that this wasn't egotism at all. It had nothing to do with him. It was a promotion of the monarchy, and in a sense, a promotion of France. Imagine what it must have been to be Louis. Think of the sheer strain to always be on public display. One historian has suggested that Louis XIV probably never had a hot meal because there was all that ceremony to bring in the meat, etc. Everything was a ritual. It wasn't all done for Louis's comfort. He would have said it was done for the good of France. After all, the king embodied France, That means he was, in a sense, France itself. He was God on earth. How would you treat God if he came to dinner? How would you treat France or Great Britain or the United States if they were embodied in a single person at their rising in the morning? How do we treat our flag? It is, after all, a mere piece of cloth, and yet we revere it in some ways as Frenchmen revered their king. In the worldview of the 17th century, this all made sense. But it was also politically astute, following the Fronde. It elevated the monarch, it made him untouchable. It reduced the nobility to servants and supplicants. It lets them hold his shirt, but it gives them no real power. There was no Richelieu, no Condé for Louis. So who did have real power in France? Why, Louis, of course. Remember, rule number 2, the king must be in control. Louis said, the position of sovereign can be properly filled only by the sovereign himself. He also said, l'état c'est moi. I am the state. Louis was tireless, working very long days, reading reports, drafting diplomatic correspondence himself. He often missed the entertainments that I mentioned before. But he couldn't do everything himself, so he assembled a corps of professional secretaries and administrators drawn not from the nobility, but from the ranks of professional men, lawyers, bankers, and merchants. His successive financial ministers, Nicolas Fouquet and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, are good examples. The reason he was interested in these people is, 1, they knew how to get things done. 2, they had financial resources which could help the crown. He was constantly borrowing money from these guys. But 3, they were not so powerful individually that they could become a center of resistance. The king could make them, he could always break them. The king never had to call the estates general, and that was another way of conserving his power. In the localities, he established trained professional bureaucrats called intendants, who collected taxes, who acted as judges, who recruited his army. This frequently allowed him to bypass traditional institutions like the local nobles or the Parlement. Now, recently, historians have cautioned us against going too far with this interpretation. Even Louis understood that he had to rule with consent, that he couldn't just write rules. So there was a sort of break on his power, but push never really came to shove because he knew how far to push it. How did the king pay for this vast bureaucracy? Well, remember number 3, the king must be wealthy. When Louis declared himself of age, the country's finances were a mess, largely from over 40 years of war. Fortunately, Louis had 2 aces up his sleeve. First, a financial genius named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who continued the Bourbon program of centralizing the monarchy. In fact, he's often thought to have perfected the idea of mercantilism, the idea that the economy should be run by the state to maximize national wealth. Colbert protected French trade and raised more money for the king with high tariffs on foreign goods, high customs rates. He encouraged, even created French industries with government loans and privileges. Many of them were tied to war, but others of them were tied to the luxury trade at Versailles. Colbert funded the French shipbuilding industry and practically founded the perfume and silk industries. He set standards of workmanship subject to government inspection. He supported exploration and colonization of French possessions in the New World, especially Canada. The idea was that these would provide raw materials, but also markets for French goods. He attacked noble privilege and tried to get them to pay taxes, with moderate success. He increased taxes on the French peasants, in particular a poll tax called the taille. This brings us to Louis's second economic weapon. Louis XIV could tax at will. Unlike the King of England, who had to get Parliament's permission to impose or raise a tax, Louis could just order it. He had so effectively reduced the power of local institutions that there was little resistance. Now, in the short run, this is terrific for him. It builds Versailles. It funds all those operas and plays and paintings and statues and armies of bureaucrats and armies of soldiers and navies of ships. But in the long run, for France, it's terrible. It hampers mercantile initiative. Everything has to be approved by the government. It hit the peasants hard, and it combined with a relative lack of taxation on the nobles and church to increase the gulf between rich and poor. Louis's legacy on religion was similarly advantageous in the short run, destructive in the long. the king must impose religious conformity on his subjects, is the next rule of absolutism. Remember that France remained bitterly divided in religion between Roman Catholics and Calvinist Protestants called Huguenots. Catholicism remained the official religion of the state. Huguenot had been granted a toleration by Louis's grandfather in 1598, but this did not sit well for Louis. Louis had been raised a Catholic. He'd been raised to believe that God was the source of his power, and that the only loyal subjects were those who believed as he believed. Only Catholics could be loyal subjects of the Sun King. For Louis, Roman Catholicism fit absolutism like a glove. It emphasized hierarchy, ritual, and obedience. How could supposedly loyal subjects choose to worship and interpret their Bible differently from their king? Though Louis virtually controlled the Catholic Church in France, he couldn't control the Huguenots. So in 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Huguenots were given a choice: convert, depart, or go to prison. Thousands fled to Germany, the Netherlands, England, North America. Now, in fact, this was a major blunder. Huguenots were among France's most industrious citizens. They were merchants, they were craftsmen, they were artists. They would enrich the economies and cultures of France's enemies. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was also a public relations disaster, for it confirmed for many Europeans the sinister reputation of international Catholicism and of Louis XIV. That reputation was born in war. As you'll remember, the fifth rule of absolutism is the king must have an army. And one way of thinking of this is that this is a guarantee of all the other four. If you weren't impressed by Versailles, if you weren't overawed by Louis's officials, if you didn't pay your taxes, if you didn't worship as the king bid, if you didn't obey like a good Catholic Frenchman, Louis could always sick the army on you. To that end, Louis launched a series of military reforms involving extensive study of fortifications and sieges. The French became the greatest builders of forts in the world. He promoted officers on merit, not just because they were noble. He standardized the enlistment at 4 years. He provided good and regular pay. Here, the idea that the king is wealthy is crucial. He offered better logistical support for the bureaucracy and regular inspections by intendants. Finally, he expanded the army to 300,000 men, the largest army in Europe at the time. It was also Europe's greatest. Now, since after the Fronde, most Frenchmen yearned for peace and quiet, Louis almost never had to use the army on his people, which meant that he could use it on his neighbors. As with his financial and religious policies, Louis's foreign policy would increase his power and prestige in the short run, but bring misery to his people in the long. The road to ruin for Louis XIV lay, as it had for Philip II, through Spain. Remember Spain? In the 17th century, Spain had still ruled a vast empire that included the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern Belgium, southern Italy, most of Central and South America, and the Philippines. But as that list implies, Spain had overextended itself in the 16th and early 17th centuries. The Protestant Netherlands had been lost in 1609, Portugal in 1640. As we have seen, Spain's involvement in the wars of religion, culminating in the 30 Years' War, had left its treasury deeply in debt, its military forces weak. By the 1670s, Spain was the sick man of Europe, a rotting hulk of an empire. Louis planned to raid the deathbed. He wanted to wear the crown of Spain as well as that of France. Now that may seem crazy, a pipe dream, but God seemed to be playing into Louis's hands, given the Spanish throne's current occupant. First, Louis had a claim to the throne because in 1659-60, in one of his last acts of statesmanship, Mazarin had engineered the Treaty of the Pyrenees, ending the conflict with Spain that had begun in the 30 Years' War. The capstone of the treaty was Louis's marriage to a Spanish princess, Marie-Thérèse. That wouldn't have mattered, of course, if the King of Spain had had heirs. But since 1665, Spain had been ruled by the sickly and mentally incompetent Carlos II, Carlos II. Carlos was something of a walking medical experiment, for he was the product of centuries of Habsburg interbreeding. Remember the Habsburgs? Remember how many territories they ruled in the early modern period? Well, the way they did that was by marrying into various royal houses and then marrying into each other's royal houses. This kept the Holy Roman Empire and Spain and lots of other places in the family, but it was hell on the family gene pool. Carlos was the end result. Among the highlights of his medical history, he was unable to stand unaided until his 4th year. He took 7 years to learn how to walk. His jaw was deformed, which made the simple act of chewing food an ordeal. He was mentally impaired and almost certainly impotent. We have seen that monarchs were thought to embody the nation over which they ruled. Carlos, known as El Hechizado, the bewitched, certainly embodied what his nation had become. Now, since Carlos was obviously not going to produce an heir, the Spanish throne and empire would be up for grabs when he died. Louis's position, bolstered by his marriage to a Spanish princess, was simple. Why not Louis? The result would be the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He took his first step toward that goal in 1667, when his army swept into the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern-day Belgium, not to be confused with the Dutch Republic, which was independent, to the north. We'll get to them in a minute. Thereafter, Louis took an avid interest in Carlos's health, sending ambassador after ambassador to inquire, and how does His Catholic Majesty feel today? How does he look? We're very concerned for him, you know. Louis's plan was that as soon as Carlos shuffled off to his heavenly reward, the French army would sweep across the Pyrenees and capture Madrid. But Carlos clung to his dismal existence year after year. And there was yet another problem with the plan: the Dutch. Obviously, Louis's dream was Europe's worst nightmare. The Catholic Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors feared it. The Anglican English feared it. And the Protestant Netherlands and Northern German princes feared it. If Louis could combine French military power with the wealth of the New World, he would be unstoppable, and international Protestantism would be in jeopardy. International trade would become a French monopoly. But the rest of Europe was not really in much of a position to do anything about it. The Holy Roman Empire was preoccupied with Muslim Ottoman invaders to the east, whom Louis cynically and actively encouraged to attack his fellow Catholic prince. In other words, here you have Louis, a Catholic, making a big deal about being a Catholic, and he's encouraging a Muslim empire to attack Catholic Austria. Talk about realpolitik. England had its own crisis in the 17th century, as we'll see in the next lecture. It was racked by a civil war from 1642 to 1660. The German princes were militarily weak. Louis gradually gobbled them up in a series of border wars in the 1670s and 80s. Only the Netherlands had the wealth and the resolve to stand against Louis's dreams of European monarchy. In the 1670s and 80s, the Dutch leader, or stadtholder, was William of Orange. This is the great-grandson of William the Silent. He rallied his people and the European powers against Louis. Now, William is interesting. Like Louis, William had a formative childhood memory. He lost his ancestral homeland, Orange, to a French invasion. He remembered, as a small boy, having to flee before French armies, this time when the Dutch Republic itself was attacked in 1672. As an adult, he saw clearly the danger of Louis's ambitions and that the Dutch were the only major Republican and Protestant continental state west of the Rhine, that they would need friends, a grand alliance to maintain a balance of power to contain Louis XIV. William's life mission began to be to create that grand alliance against the Bourbon Catholic domination of Europe. That is why, for Louis, the road to Madrid lay through Amsterdam. Louis knew that if he ever invaded Spain itself, he would face a Dutch invasion on his northern border. And so the Sun King spent the 1670s and 80s conquering the many small states along the Rhine and Dutch border: Franche-Comté, Luxembourg, Lorraine, Orange, which we've mentioned before, and the Spanish Netherlands. He didn't actually need Orange, he just wanted to stick it to William. The point was to encircle the Netherlands and cut it off from potential Protestant allies like Hanover and Brandenburg, Prussia, and Denmark and other German princes. By the late 1680s, Louis was planning his coup de grace, a final war to wipe the Dutch off the map. In the words of his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, it is impossible that His Majesty should tolerate any longer the insolence and arrogance of that nation. By 1688, Louis XIV was on the verge of becoming the virtual emperor of the Western world. But the Dutch were about to get a great ally, one which would bring the Sun King not only to the bargaining table, but metaphorically to his knees. Unexpectedly, and for reasons that will take 2 whole lectures to explain, the Dutch would find that ally in England.